June 6, 1944. The shells are falling where they shouldn't be. German observers along the Normandy coast are radioing coordinates that don't match any intelligence brief, reporting ship formations that shouldn't exist, describing a naval force so massive it can only mean one thing: someone lied about who was really coming. For months, Hitler built his Atlantic Wall believing the British would lead this invasion, that America was the junior partner, the logistical supporter, the secondary force. But now, through the smoke and the pre-dawn darkness, his commanders are watching something else entirely: an armada so impossibly large, so mechanically precise, so industrially overwhelming that no European power could have assembled it. The radios crackle with panic because the numbers don't just exceed expectations, they shatter the entire strategic framework the Third Reich built its coastal defense upon. And somewhere in the Allied command structure, U.S. Navy intelligence officers are reading the intercepted German communications, watching in real time as the enemy realizes they prepared for the wrong invasion. But here's what those intelligence reports never quite explained. How long did they know Hitler believed the lie? When did they first understand his miscalculation? And more disturbingly, did they let him stay blind longer than the mission required? The first German coastal battery commander to understand what was happening wasn't supposed to be on duty that morning. Oberleutnant Werner Pluskat had spent the night in his bunker above Omaha Beach, and when his forward observers woke him before dawn, their voices carried something he'd never heard before: confusion mixed with fear. They told him to look through the observation scope himself because they didn't trust what they were seeing. Pluskat pressed his eyes to the lens and swept across the horizon, expecting perhaps a small flotilla, maybe a diversionary raid, something manageable within the parameters of every briefing he'd received about Allied capabilities. What he saw instead made him freeze. The English Channel, from one end of his vision to the other, was covered in ships. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transport vessels, landing craft, an unbroken line of steel stretching beyond what his scope could capture, all moving in formation so precise they looked like a single organism. He grabbed the phone to headquarters, and when the operations officer answered, Pluskat said the words that would be recorded in German war diaries: "There must be 10,000 ships out there." The officer on the other end paused, then asked the question that revealed everything about how deeply Germany had miscalculated. "What flag are they flying?" Pluskat looked again through the scope at the nearest destroyers, at the battleships beginning their bombardment runs, at the command vessels coordinating the assault. American flags. All of them. The stars and stripes on ship after ship after ship, a visual contradiction to every intelligence estimate that had promised this invasion would be a British operation with American support elements. The naval gunfire began systematically destroying his position before he could fully process what he was witnessing. Not random shelling, but coordinated fire missions, the kind of precision that required extensive naval training, sophisticated fire control systems, and a level of inter-ship communication the German Navy had always believed only they possessed. Within 90 minutes, Pluskat's entire defensive sector was being suppressed by a firepower concentration that exceeded anything the Royal Navy could have assembled alone, and the reports flooding into German headquarters from every observation post along the coast were telling the same impossible story. The invasion force was overwhelmingly, undeniably, catastrophically American. The Kriegsmarine liaison officers reading these reports in real time understood the implications immediately because they'd been tracking Allied naval movements for months, counting hulls, identifying ship classes, watching the buildup. But their intelligence assessments had been filtered through a strategic assumption that now lay shattered across every radio frequency: that Britain, exhausted and resource-depleted, would lead this cross-channel assault with token American participation. Instead, the U.S. Navy had assembled the largest amphibious fleet in human history, and they'd done it so efficiently, so completely, that German intelligence hadn't just underestimated the scale, they'd fundamentally misidentified who was driving the entire operation. By mid-morning, as American troops were fighting their way off the beaches under the cover of naval bombardment that never stopped, never slackened, never ran out of ammunition, the truth was becoming undeniable in German command posts from Normandy to Berlin. They had prepared for the wrong enemy, fortified against the wrong threat, and built their entire coastal defense doctrine around a premise that was now killing them. The strategic miscalculation didn't happen by accident. It grew from a carefully constructed German understanding of Allied capabilities that made perfect sense until it didn't. Throughout 1943 and into early 1944, Nazi intelligence had built a comprehensive picture of what a cross-channel invasion would look like, and every piece of that picture pointed to British leadership. The logic was airtight. Britain had been fighting since 1939, had developed amphibious assault doctrine through hard lessons in Norway and North Africa, possessed detailed knowledge of French coastal geography from centuries of naval operations, and most importantly, had the immediate strategic need to liberate Europe before their island nation collapsed under the weight of total war. America, in this assessment, was the industrial powerhouse, the supplier, the builder of ships and planes and tanks, but not yet the tactical leader of complex European military operations. Hitler himself had reinforced this assumption repeatedly in strategic meetings, dismissing American military capability as untested, their soldiers as soft, their commanders as inexperienced in the kind of brutal, close-quarters warfare that defined the European theater. The German High Command expected to face Montgomery's methodical British planning, Churchill's politically driven timelines, and a Royal Navy that, while experienced, was stretched dangerously thin after years of convoy protection and Mediterranean operations. They fortified accordingly. The Atlantic Wall's strongest positions faced the Pas-de-Calais, where British invasion logic would dictate the shortest crossing, the fastest route to Germany's industrial heartland. Rommel's inspection reports from early 1944 consistently reference British tactical patterns, British equipment capabilities, British logistical limitations. Naval intelligence briefings analyzed Royal Navy ship availability, British landing craft production, even British tidal calculation methods. When German reconnaissance flights photographed the massive buildup in southern England, analysts cataloged the formations and concluded this was Britain marshalling every resource for one desperate gamble, with American forces present but subordinate. The Kriegsmarine's assessment was particularly detailed. They calculated that Britain could assemble perhaps 3,000 vessels for an invasion, that American contribution might add another 1,000 support ships, and that the resulting fleet, while formidable, would be manageable within existing German defensive frameworks. They expected British battleships they knew, British destroyer tactics they'd fought against, British naval gunnery doctrine they'd studied. What they didn't expect, what their entire intelligence apparatus failed to predict, was that the United States Navy had spent 2 years not just building ships but revolutionizing amphibious warfare itself. While German analysts were counting British hulls and studying Montgomery's North African campaigns, the U.S. Navy had been training entire fleets in coordinated assault operations, developing fire support techniques that turned battleships into mobile artillery platforms, creating communication systems that could coordinate thousands of vessels simultaneously, and most critically, building specialized landing craft in numbers that exceeded total German estimates for the entire Allied fleet. The Americans hadn't just joined a British operation, they'd industrialized invasion, turned it from a daring military gamble into a manufactured certainty, applied the same mass production logic to amphibious assault that they'd applied to Liberty ships and B-17 bombers. But in German headquarters as late as June 5, 1944, the working assumption remained unchanged. This would be Montgomery's show, Britain's desperate bid, and America's supporting role. The miscalculation about American naval capability wasn't new on June 6th. It had been happening in plain sight for months, and each time German intelligence saw evidence that contradicted their assumptions, they found ways to explain it away. In November 1943, U-boat commander Captain Lieutenant Heinrich Schroeder surfaced his submarine briefly off the coast of Iceland and observed what he described in his war diary as an impossible convoy. Over 200 ships moving in formation, protected by destroyers using coordination techniques he'd never encountered, with air cover so dense his boat couldn't remain surface for more than 90 seconds. He radioed the sighting to Kriegsmarine headquarters, emphasizing that the escort vessels were nearly all American and operating with a level of anti-submarine efficiency that suggested extensive training and new detection equipment. The intelligence report that resulted from his observation noted the American presence, but concluded this was likely a one-time concentration for a major supply run, not evidence of systematic naval capability. 2 months later, in January 1944, German reconnaissance aircraft photographed the naval facilities at Plymouth and Portsmouth, and the analyst who studied the images noticed something disturbing. The number of American landing craft visible in British ports had tripled since the previous reconnaissance flight, and they weren't just Liberty ships or cargo vessels but specialized assault craft, LSTs, LCIs, LCVPs, in quantities that suggested someone was preparing for an operation far larger than. anything the British had attempted. His report reached Admiral Donat's staff with a clear warning that American amphibious capability was being severely underestimated, but the conclusion drawn by senior intelligence officers was that these craft were being staged for British use, that American production was supplying British operations, not preparing for independent American assault command. The pattern continued through the spring. In March, intercepted Allied communications revealed extensive American naval training exercises off the coast of Scotland, full-scale invasion rehearsals involving thousands of troops and dozens of ships practicing coordinated beach assaults. German signals intelligence noted the scale, but interpreted it as Americans learning British methods, not developing their own doctrine. In April, a Luftwaffe pilot returning from a reconnaissance mission over southern England reported seeing what he estimated as over 500 American warships concentrated in a single anchorage, a number so large that his debriefing officer assumed he'd miscounted or was exaggerating under stress. The report was filed but never escalated. In May, just weeks before D-Day, a German agent operating in Lisbon sent a detailed message describing conversations with Portuguese dock workers who'd serviced American vessels, workers who described seeing American naval crews practicing amphibious coordination techniques that seemed far more advanced than anything the Royal Navy was doing. The agent's report specifically warned that American forces appear to be preparing to lead, not support, a major operation. Intelligence analysts in Berlin read the report and dismissed it as Allied disinformation, precisely because it contradicted the foundational assumption that Britain, not America, would command any invasion. Each failure to recognize what was happening had the same structure. Evidence arrived, evidence was acknowledged, and then evidence was reinterpreted to fit the existing strategic framework rather than challenging that framework itself. The warnings weren't just ignored, they were actively suppressed by a command structure that had already committed to a different reality. In February 1944, Fregaton Captain Karl Dobelski von Eichane, a naval intelligence officer stationed in Paris, compiled a comprehensive assessment titled American Naval Capabilities in the European Theater that should have changed everything. Von Eichane had spent 6 months analyzing intercepted communications, reconnaissance photographs, and reports from agents across occupied Europe, and his conclusion was blunt. The United States Navy had assembled an invasion force that exceeded combined British and American estimates from just a year earlier, and more critically, American commanders were developing autonomous operational control separate from British strategic planning. His report included specific evidence, photographs of American admirals conducting independent planning sessions, intercepts showing American naval units operating under separate command structures, even analysis of American training exercises that bore no resemblance to British amphibious doctrine. He sent the assessment directly to Admiral Theodor Krank, the German Navy's commander in the West, with a cover memo that stated explicitly, "We are preparing to defend against a British invasion when the evidence suggests American operational leadership." The report was read, annotated, and then quietly filed without being forwarded to Hitler's headquarters. Krank's chief of staff later told von Eichane that presenting intelligence suggesting massive American capability would be strategically unhelpful because it contradicted the Führer's assessment of American military weakness. But von Eichane wasn't the only one raising alarms. Throughout the spring of 1944, individual U-boat commanders were sending after-action reports describing encounters with American destroyer escorts using tactics and technology that seemed impossibly advanced, sonar systems that tracked submarines with unprecedented accuracy, depth charge patterns that suggested sophisticated mathematical targeting, communication between ships that allowed them to coordinate attacks in ways German naval doctrine insisted were impossible without years of joint training. These reports accumulated in Kriegsmarine files, each one documenting capabilities that didn't match official intelligence assessments, and each one being explained away as exaggeration, combat stress, or Allied luck. There were test results, too. In April, German naval laboratories analyzed debris recovered from an American destroyer sunk off the Norwegian coast, and the technical team examining the wreckage found fire control systems, radar equipment, and communication technology that were not just advanced but represented entirely different engineering approaches than what German intelligence believed American industry could produce. The lead analyst wrote that the equipment suggested a level of naval fire control integration we previously believed was 5 years from Allied capability. His report recommended immediate revision of threat assessments regarding American naval gunnery. It was never acted upon. Even Hitler's own naval liaison staff had doubts. Admiral Karl Jesko von Puttkamer, who attended the Führer's daily military briefings, later testified that by May 1944, junior intelligence officers were quietly circulating estimates suggesting the invasion force would be predominantly American, but these estimates were never formally presented because senior officers knew Hitler's ideological conviction that Americans lacked the discipline and strategic thinking for complex military operations made contradicting evidence unwelcome. The men manning Germany's Atlantic Wall defenses paid for their command's blindness with their lives. But what killed them wasn't just the shells. It was the psychological collapse that came from facing something they'd been assured wouldn't exist. Unteroffizier Hans Wegner commanded a reinforced concrete bunker position at Point du Hoc, a gun emplacement specifically designed to destroy British landing craft using tactics German intelligence had studied from the Dieppe raid 2 years earlier. His crew had trained for months on British approach patterns, British naval gunfire support rhythms, British assault timing. When the bombardment started just before dawn on June 6th, Wegner's first thought was that the intensity was wrong, too sustained, too precise, too overwhelming to match any British naval capability he'd been briefed about. Then the shells started landing with such accuracy that his bunker's observation slits became death traps, and he realized the fire wasn't coming from ships firing general barrages, but from individual American destroyers providing targeted close support, adjusting their aim in real time based on spotter aircraft he couldn't even see through the smoke. His position lasted 17 minutes under that kind of precision bombardment before the walls cracked, and his men abandoned their guns, not because they were cowards, but because they'd been trained to survive British naval gunfire doctrine, and this was something else entirely, industrial-scale destruction delivered with mechanical efficiency. Across the invasion beaches, similar scenes were repeating. At Omaha Beach, Oberfeldwebel Heinrich Severloh had positioned his MG-42 machine gun to cover the approaches exactly as doctrine dictated for defending against British assault waves. But when the first American landing craft hit the beach, they came in numbers and with support coordination that made his defensive plan meaningless. He fired over 12,000 rounds that day, and later, in his memoir, he described the horror of watching American naval destroyers move so close to shore they were almost grounding themselves to provide direct fire support for the pinned-down troops, a tactic so aggressive and so skillfully executed that he knew immediately no British naval commander would risk capital ships that way. The American Navy was operating under different rules, accepting different risks, demonstrating a confidence in their damage control and seamanship that came from training Severloh's intelligence briefings had insisted didn't exist. The psychological effect on German defenders went beyond simple fear. These were professional soldiers who'd fought in Russia, in North Africa, who'd survived years of warfare by understanding their enemy's capabilities and limitations. But on June 6th, their understanding shattered. Lieutenant Arthur Yankee, commanding Strongpoint W5 at Utah Beach, later told interrogators that the worst moment wasn't when his position was being destroyed, but when he first saw the scale of the American fleet through his binoculars and realized everything his superiors had told him about the invasion was wrong. His men had prepared for a desperate British gamble they might actually repel. Instead, they were facing an American industrial operation that had already succeeded before the first soldier touched the sand. The naval gunfire didn't stop. That's what broke the defenders psychologically more than anything else. The shells just kept coming hour after hour, from ships that never seemed to run out of ammunition, coordinated by fire control systems that adjusted faster than German troops could relocate. Soldiers in bunkers reported the surreal experience of being suppressed so completely by American naval firepower that they couldn't even attempt the counterattack maneuvers they'd rehearsed, couldn't reach the beach defenses they'd spent months preparing, couldn't execute any of the tactics designed around British limitations. In some sectors, entire German units surrendered not because they were overrun, but because the naval bombardment was so overwhelming and so precise that continuing to fight felt like suicide rather than combat. And the American sailors delivering that firepower were executing missions with a casualness that suggested this wasn't even difficult for them. Destroyer captains bringing their ships into depths that should have grounded them. Fire control officers adjusting salvos while under return fire from shore batteries. Communication crews coordinating dozens of ships simultaneously as if they'd been doing it for years, which, it turned out, they had. The human cost wasn't just German. Every Allied soldier who hit those beaches depended on the enemy's miscalculation, holding long enough for the naval gunfire to do its work. If Hitler had understood earlier what was really coming, If German defenses had been positioned and fortified to face American naval capabilities instead of British ones, the destroyers might not have been able to get that close, the fire support might not have been that effective, and the bodies on Omaha Beach would have been counted in tens of thousands instead of thousands. Hitler didn't officially acknowledge the scale of his miscalculation until 3 days after the invasion, and by then it didn't matter. The American Navy had already established such complete naval superiority off the Normandy coast that German counterattack plans became irrelevant before they could be executed. But the question that haunts the historical record isn't when Hitler realized the truth. It's how long Allied intelligence knew he was operating under a false assumption and whether that knowledge was weaponized deliberately. The intercepts existed. The decoded German communications sat in files at Bletchley Park and in U.S. Navy intelligence offices, conversations between German commanders revealing again and again that they expected a British-led operation, that they were positioning forces based on British tactical doctrine, that their entire defensive strategy rested on facing an enemy who wasn't coming. Someone was reading those intercepts in real time. Someone understood that the Germans had built their Atlantic Wall to stop the wrong invasion. And someone made the decision not to correct that misunderstanding, to let Hitler keep believing the lie, even as American ships assembled in numbers that would have forced a complete German strategic reassessment if recognized early enough. The intelligence reports that might explain this decision remained classified or were destroyed, leaving only fragments, memo references to preserving enemy miscalculation, brief mentions in post-war debriefings of strategic deception extending beyond operational security. But there's a darker possibility embedded in those fragments. That Allied command recognized Germany's fundamental misreading of American capability so early that they had time to reinforce it, to feed it, to make absolutely certain Hitler stayed blind till the moment American battleships appeared on the horizon and made correction impossible. If that's true, then D-Day wasn't just a military operation, it was a demonstration, a deliberate revelation designed to psychologically destroy German strategic confidence at the precise moment when that destruction would be most devastating. And if Allied intelligence was willing to manipulate enemy assumptions that profoundly for Normandy, what other German miscalculations were being carefully preserved, quietly nurtured, allowed to fester until the moment when revealing the truth would inflict maximum damage? The naval war in the Atlantic didn't end on June 6th. German U-boats kept hunting convoys, German surface raiders kept threatening supply lines, and somewhere in classified files, intelligence officers kept reading intercepts that suggested the enemy still didn't understand what they were really fighting. How many more times did we let them stay wrong? How many more strategic blindnesses did we watch develop and choose not to correct? And most disturbingly, if we were willing to let thousands die on both sides to preserve a deception until the perfect moment of revelation, what does that say about the cost we were willing to pay for psychological warfare?